So what I want to do in this video, which is part 2 of this series, is unpack this concept of pedagogy of discomfort. And I'm going to focus specifically upon the last chapter of Megan Boler's book, Feeling Power, Emotions, and Education. So rather than go through a point-by-point analysis, which would take forever, I've purposely chosen to highlight specific passages that I feel best convey this concept or methodology. Now, I need to state this up front. I am not in any way trying to besmirch the character of Professor Boler or attack her as a person. Not only is that wrong and an invalid form of argumentation, but it's not who I am. I am opposed to any kind of ad hominem or genetic fallacy arguments which attack the person rather than the argument. Now, that doesn't mean that calling into question someone's character or questioning the origin of an idea is always a fallacy. There are times when that line of argumentation is not only appropriate, but necessary. But making that crucial distinction between the two is another video in itself. And the other reason is this: as a human being, I am no better than anyone else. I have, if anything, seemed to have perfected the art of walking straight into one hypocrisy after another. So I have no moral high ground to stand upon. And ultimately, Professor Boler is stamped with the same image that I am stamped with. However, with that being said, when it comes to an idea, I have a no-holds-barred approach, and I will subject this concept of pedagogy of discomfort to criticism because I believe it is not only theoretically wrong, but immoral, because it subtly inverts the moral universe of the classroom and I believe takes advantage of the student's lack of knowledge and experience. And therefore, any educator who uses this pedagogical approach is not involved in education, but in deception, manipulation, and indoctrination. And the reason I do this is not to be some sort of flamethrower burning people to the ground or to gain clicks to my channel, but to defend the truth and to tear down ideas, not people, but ideas that are not only harmful for indigenous people, but for all people. So with this disclaimer in place, let's get to it. So we're going to jump right into the text. In the introductory section of this chapter, Professor Boler makes this statement: as inquiry, a pedagogy of discomfort emphasizes collective witnessing as opposed to individualized self-reflection. I distinguish witnessing from spectating as one entry into a collectivized engagement in learning to see differently. A central focus of my discussion is the emotions that often arise in the process of examining cherished beliefs and assumptions. I address defensive anger, fear of change, and fear of losing our personal and cultural identities. An ethical aim of a pedagogy of discomfort is willingly to inhabit a more ambiguous and flexible sense of self. Now I want to unpack this quote, and we see that right off the bat that there is an immediate contrast between two types of learning. And as all good social justice theorists are wont to do, they place great value upon a collectivistic over individualistic form of education. And this distinction is important because this is part of the lineage of critical pedagogy, tracing back to the Brazilian educator and lifelong Marxist Paulo Freire in his infamous Pedagogy of the Oppressed. For Freire and those that followed in his footsteps, teaching is not just dialogical. It's not just a passive transaction of information from teacher to student. For Freire, teaching is always a revolutionary act and is inherently political and should always seek to awaken what he calls the dormant class consciousness of the student. Teaching for Freire at all times should be aimed at epistemological transformation. And this is something that Freire is adamant about. Those progressive educators who view critical pedagogy as mere method or reduce his teaching to mere technique fail to appreciate the radical nature, vision, and mission of his pedagogy. Teaching, according to Freire, should at all times be liberatory, an act of liberation. This is because critical pedagogy has an entire philosophical and social worldview attached to it, which is what we talked about in part 1 of the series, which is critical theory, with the overarching goal to be one of transformation, both at the personal and societal level. Now, this background information is important because Professor Boler's concept of pedagogy of discomfort stands firmly within this radical tradition. And specifically, what she is targeting with this concept of discomfort is the emotional responses of her students as they question and examine their most cherished beliefs within a classroom of peers with a curriculum designed specifically to provoke feelings of discomfort, emotional fear, anger, and loss of one's personal and cultural identity. In short, this pedagogy strives to induce a real existential and psychological crisis within the mind of the student, and this objective is not tangential nor a peripheral goal, but is the main goal of this pedagogy. It's right there in that quote. And yet, as shocking as that sounds, these emotional feelings of discomfort are simply means to yet a still greater end or greater purpose, which forces us to ask, what is that greater purpose? Well, that last sentence of that quote clues us into exactly what that purpose is. The aim of this pedagogy is to liberate the students from the oppressive idea of a centered person, to occupy a more ambiguous and flexible sense of self. Throughout the rest of this chapter, Professor Boler elaborates upon this idea of a more ambiguous self, which I will unpack as we continue. But for now, I need to say this. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the counter opposite of Socrates' famous admonition to know thyself, in which the student, upon admitting ignorance, is then ready to receive truth, knowledge, beauty, goodness, virtue, and wisdom. Admitting ignorance is the first step to learning. It is to be receptive, to be open, to be teachable. The goal of education is to move towards knowledge, not further away from knowledge. It is to seek greater clarity of thought and precision and not increase ambiguity and confusion. Yet it appears that Professor Boler wants to replace that tried and true classical tradition with ambiguity now being the goal of education. Now, I want to elaborate upon this for a bit. The goal of education is to expose the mind to truth and for the mind to latch onto truth and transform the person. So many times educators present truth as merely a theoretical abstraction, as an end in itself, or at best as merely an intellectual curiosity, and fail to speak about the intimately moral and personal dimension to truth, which is that truth should affect the whole person. That's one of the goals of education. This is where critical pedagogy gets it right and wrong at the same time. Teaching should be transformative, but teaching towards truth or towards an approximation of truth and not further away from truth. Moving towards nebulousness, vagueness, and away from truth should not be viewed as transformative, but as the antithesis of education, as de-transformative or as deconstructive. Truth is transformative because it centers the mind, it centers a person, and gives order and balance to the mind. And I will say this to the day I die, but when you can articulate to yourself first what you believe and why you believe what you believe, not only is that one of the goals of education, but it is also one of the truest forms of self-esteem. The purpose of education is to gain clarity over our own thoughts, which is a lifelong process, and not to increase uncertainty, obscurity, and ambiguity. We are supposed to unshackle ourselves and leave the darkness of Plato's allegorical cave and not remain in a childish state of ignorance and darkness. Now, I can't promise you that a life of the mind will give you a fulfilled life, because although clarity of thought is necessary, it is not sufficient. However, I can promise you that the alternative that Professor Boler aims for will increase, not decrease, your lack of clarity, imprecision, apprehensiveness, indecisiveness, anxiousness, and cognitive dissonance. To be honest, I don't know how a decentered, morally ambiguous person can be a worthy goal, and I stake my claim to this, because I know from my own personal experience that living a fractured existence, a disconnect between the head and the heart, a state of cognitive dissonance is not fun. And the one thing that academia seems to love to glorify and inflate beyond proportion is the trope of the tortured soul. Embracing ethical relativism, which is what this pedagogical concept seems to imply, is not an enlightened or progressive position, nor is it liberating by any stretch of the imagination, but it is instead personally and socially destructive and regressive, and leads not to an increase of pleasure, but of psychic pain. The disjointed individual should not be a role model that anyone purposely seeks to emulate. This may sound old-fashioned, but striving to lead a moral life is its own reward. Take it from an expert in hypocrisy. A life of moral ambiguity is a life of narcissism, and that only brings in the end emptiness and not happiness. Now, if you think I'm being unfair, let me go to the immediate next section in which Professor Boler makes this statement. The call for critical inquiry in the liberal tradition is easily subsumed within the hollow invocations of values of dialogue, democracy, and rationality. Deeply rooted in Western conceptions of liberal individualism, this common rhetoric threatens to reduce genuine inquiry to an individualized process with no collective accountability. Instead, we are challenged to distinguish collective witnessing, for example, from the familiar notions of critical inquiry. Here, Professor Boler is critiquing critical inquiry, which is not critical theory. Critical inquiry is what we mean by critical thinking. It's the ability for self-reflection, the ability to cultivate critical inquiry or critical thinking is a skill that Professor Boler discounts as mere rhetoric, as hollow invocations of values coming out of a liberal tradition. Her objection to critical inquiry should be somewhat obvious by now, because what she is objecting to is not so much critical inquiry or critical thinking in itself, but critical inquiry done under the wrong belief system or worldview. And what is needed is critical inquiry done under the correct worldview, which in this case belongs to the critical social justice theorist. Now, do you see what's happened? Education has imperceptibly been replaced with adherence not to the pursuit of objective truth, but to the educator's own personal belief system. It's a subtle but profound shift which completely alters the very foundation of education. Now we have to ask, what is the danger of reducing genuine inquiry to an individualized process? Well, according to Professor Boler, these traditional constructs don't render enough emotional discomfort in the student so as to elicit the goal of social change. Individualized learning leaves out a key ingredient, and that ingredient is, according to Professor Boler, social responsibility. Now, I want to focus upon this because most typical postmodern collectivist accounts of society are really just a rehashing of warmed over modern collectivism, albeit with a postmodern twist, which still views the individual as subservient to the greater good of society. That is, the individual not only exists for the sake of society, the collective, but must sacrifice his or her own interests for the sake of others. And the great danger, according to critical pedagogy, is that individualistic learning leaves out this key critical component of collective social accountability. Therefore, one of the goals of this pedagogy is to awaken social accountability within the student by selectively disturbing and disrupting their emotional makeup amongst a classroom of peers so as to compel them to confront either their own supposed privilege or oppression under what is seen as a socially constructed system of power. It is to force upon them within this very rigged environment a new belief system, but not just any belief system, but the educator's belief system. Let me restate this. This pedagogy is designed on purpose to cause so much emotional distress, discomfort, and confusion within the mind of the student that he or she eventually succumbs to the social pressure and relinquishes their own personal, private, and not yet fully formed belief system to that of the social justice educator. Now, do you see once again the radical difference in education? The older traditional conception of traditional education is to present to the student information and knowledge without emotional duress and allow the student to absorb, question, reject, supplement, or synthesize their own beliefs with this new information. This traditional process that I'm describing is wholly left to the student. And if the introduction of new ideas causes the student to revise his or her own belief system, or even causes a complete paradigm shift, then still nowhere in this traditional process is the student compelled or forced through manipulative tactics to change their cherished beliefs. This, however, is exactly what this pedagogy aims to accomplish. This is not education, but re-education. Now, getting back to the text, I want to focus upon a quote from a graduate student in one of Professor Boler's seminars that she uses as a specific example of what her pedagogy can achieve. When I begin to feel as if I had gained some truth, I discovered that it is only partially the truth, or even a lie. I am confused by the contradictions from what I was brought up believing and what I am now starting to learn. Now, that short phrase, what I was brought up believing, should scare the living scheisse out of you. I'm not questioning the student's narrative or the possible beneficial effect that Professor Boler's Pedagogy of Discomfort had upon the student. Maybe it was beneficial. I'm willing to grant that. What I am questioning is this: does this belong in the classroom? should the purposeful undermining of beliefs that one was brought up believing be something that a teacher purposely does? And remember, this is not incidental. This is the main goal of this pedagogy. And my question is this: do we want a society where our educators take it upon themselves to purposely cause confusion and contradiction within the minds of students? Is this something we want our teachers to be doing? And if so, what, pray tell, are their qualifications? And I bring this up because the intersection between the emotions and beliefs that occurs within the mind, especially a young, impressionable mind that is still developing, is an exceedingly complex issue that some of the greatest thinkers disagree upon. It may not only be inscrutable, but exceedingly dangerous to tinker with. Yet Professor Boler's concept of pedagogy of discomfort is either unaware of these profound issues or proceeds upon the assumption that these quite possibly intractable problems have either been resolved or can be ignored because social justice is a much more pressing issue. In other words, don't worry about making that tough decision because an educator operating under this pedagogy is willing to make that sacrifice on your children on behalf of you. Now, my second related criticism is brief, and it's this. These are issues that have been historically outside the province of the educator, and for good reason. This domain or territory of the mind, the emotions and beliefs, and or the soul has historically been the province of parents, family, extended family, one's cultural environment, pastors, priests, theologians, physicians of the soul, or trained therapists, counselors, and clinical psychologists with years of professional training and oversight, and not postmodern, morally ambiguous ethical relativist with an ideological axe to grind. I'm not going to pull any intellectual punches here. I don't view this pedagogy as objective, professional, academic, clinical, healthy, moral, nor in good faith, but a form of psychological intimidation, demoralization, and indoctrination. And if this is the means that these social justice theorists are using to bring about their promised utopia, then I want nothing to do with it. Now, I'm going to skip ahead and read this next statement and make a quick comment on. The invitation to question cherished beliefs is not one all students readily accept. A number of my white students' responses explicitly stated that they felt angry, confused, and blamed. These students' comments reflect the discomfort encountered when attempting to inhabit a morally ambiguous self. Now, I just want to say this. Good for them. I'm glad that these students are objecting to inhabiting a morally ambiguous self. I am glad that they are choosing to retain a modicum of their sanity and are morally objecting to this radical narrative being forced upon them. At least they are standing up for themselves, and that's what needs to be done. People need to be proactive and realize when they are being played. People need to calmly and rationally, but firmly and tactfully, object to being force-fed this new religious dogma, which is exactly what this is. Now, this next quote takes the prize and is what I consider as the piece de résistance of the pedagogy of discomfort. Professor Boler makes this statement. Many educators express their frustration that as they teach social issues such as histories of racism, they encounter white students' unproductive guilt. On the one hand, the student who assumes the guilty position often stops participating in discussion, feels blamed, possibly defensively angry, and may refuse to engage in further complex self-reflection or critical inquiry. At the same time, guilt cannot be done away with altogether. Not all actions are acceptable or ethical. The challenge within educational environments is to create a space for honest and collective self-reflection and inquiry rather than closing off discussion. At the same time, such inquiry needs to avoid letting ourselves off the hook from responsibilities and ethical complexities. Now, the first thing I want you to notice in that first sentence is the implication of guilt already assigned to some of her students. She is taking the immutable characteristics that one is born with and has no control over and assigning guilt to this entire class of people born with this characteristic. Ladies and gentlemen, that is the definition of racism. That is essentialism. But it gets better, or I should say worse, because even those students who do accept their moral culpability still haven't done enough under Professor Boler's paradigm. You see, it's not enough that they accept their guilt. They must be made to feel their guilt. It's right there in those sentences. Otherwise, their guilt is unproductive, which means that they are still part of the system and contributing to the oppression of their fellow classmates. How dare they let themselves off the hook? That's the implicit message that is being transmitted loudly and clearly to their fellow classmates, that they are guilty, but refusing to own up to it. Their denial simply compounds their guilt. Now, I want to introduce into my analysis the work of a well-known psychiatrist who studied the coercive effects of psychological manipulation, or what he referred to as thought reform, that prisoners of war suffered from during the Korean War at the hands of the Chinese government. His name is Dr. Robert J. Lifton, and what he discovered is shockingly similar to the methods and tactics being used in today's classroom. The first story that Dr. Lifton recounts is a man named Dr. Vincent, who had suffered imprisonment and acute re-education for 3.5 years for a crime he never committed. And I want you to pay attention to the words he uses to describe his experience. When Dr. Vincent was found wanting in his adoption of the people's standpoint, or when his views were considered erroneous, it became necessary for him to examine himself and look into the causes of these reactionary tendencies. He had to search out the harmful bourgeois and imperialistic influences from his past for further evaluation and self-criticism. Every question or problem had to be solved according to the facts, in order to get to the truth, viewing everything, of course, from the people's standpoint. Look at what Dr. Vincent must do. He must examine himself and perform a constant self-criticism to see if any of the influences from his past do not match up with the people's standpoint. Look at that last line. Is this not describing problematizing, but not problematizing of only abstract meta-narratives, but of the human person himself? Now, if you don't see the similarities, let me read to you another section from this book. In this section, the story of Dr. Vincent and what he underwent is combined with that of another prisoner named Father Luca, who had also been in prison for 3.5 years and also faced what has come to be known infamously as these psychological struggle sessions. Dr. Vincent and Father Luca found themselves unanimously condemned by an infallible environment. The message of guilt which they received was both existential, you are guilty, and psychologically demanding, you must learn to feel guilty. Remember what I said earlier, it's not enough to admit or accept your guilt. You must be made to feel your guilt. Otherwise, it is unproductive guilt. What Dr. Lifton is describing is the process by which these men are being prepared or conditioned to not only accept their guilt, but how they must correct and pay penance for this guilt. Until these men are made to feel their odiousness, their sinfulness, and the stench of their own guilt, then they will still retain a sense of their own internal innocence, internal coherence, and therefore internal identity, which will act as both a buffer and hindrance and prove unproductive for their re-education. Their natural internal defense mechanism, if you will, must be undermined through psychological manipulation and trauma. Now, why did I mention this? And why is this important? It's important because once you break down a human being's natural internal defense mechanism, you've effectively shattered that person. You've taken something essential from them. A person who accepts punishment for a crime they did not commit is a person who is both easily pliable and broken. Now, I want to quote again from Dr. Lifton for one last time. The series of denunciations of friends and colleagues which both Dr. Vincent and Father Luca were required to make has special significance. Not only did making these accusations increase their feelings of guilt and shame, it put them in the position of subverting the structures of their own lives. They were, in effect, being made to renounce the people, the organizations, and the standards of behavior which had formed the matrix of their previous existence. They were being forced to betray not so much their friends and colleagues as a vital core of themselves. What is this describing if not the undermining of not only their cherished beliefs, but the very core of their own identity? The purpose of their re-education was to compress the feelings of shame and guilt so deeply into the fiber of each man's being until they lost a vital sense of themselves, at which time they became receptive to the crimes charged against them. Now, I want you to think about what this pedagogy of discomfort also does. Does it not also create emotional trauma with the intended purpose of changing and modifying behavior? Isn't the goal to get the students to renounce their former beliefs? Does it not also problematize the student? And does it not also turn the entire classroom against any holdout students? Is this pedagogy of discomfort and the critical theory that undergirds it, that takes place in a classroom environment, and the language we've read so far, not also describing a struggle session? Now, to be fair, Professor Boler does throughout this chapter say that her pedagogy of discomfort is an invitation to inquiry and not a demand, nor does it attempt to enforce a particular political agenda. And she does make those statements throughout. However, I view those statements as either naive or confused because the mere fact that she introduces this pedagogical concept of discomfort into the classroom is itself the issue. The issue is that once this method enters the classroom, then this cancels out any sense of the word invitation and nullifies any moral high ground that claims that this is some sort of benign open process between teacher, student, and fellow classmates. In other words, the introduction of this teaching method, because it skews the playing field right out of the gate, places the student into a position that demands of him or her that a decision be made, which completely drains any meaning out of the word invitation and the moral import behind that word. Furthermore, Professor Boler throughout this chapter and throughout this book argues that education is never neutral and always involves a political or social agenda, which means, by her own admission, that her chosen pedagogy can be neither neutral nor exempt from pushing her own political agenda. Once she makes that statement, she must live with the consequences of it and can no longer hide behind comforting words to hide this radical pedagogy. Now, I want to focus upon something that I've noticed within this type of literature, which is a redefining of the application of guilt. The traditional view is that individual guilt can be only applied to the individuals responsible. Professor Boler, with her pedagogy of discomfort, flips this narrative by assigning guilt not to the individual, but to the group, which in this case is the students within her own classroom. There's this real subtle narrative shift or intellectual sleight of hand that occurs where she is subtly redefining and introducing this completely new conception of guilt, which completely alters the moral landscape in the process. And the disturbing part is that probably not 1 in 10 students know what is going on. It's not that they are unintelligent, it's simply that they don't have the analytical tools yet to articulate this vague notion that something has gone awry. And what they are experiencing is this obtuse sort of cognitive dissonance between what they are being told by this authority figure, what they are feeling now, and what they know to be true. The students who do not accept this reframing of the moral universe intuitively know that something is not right, but they can't put their finger on it. That, to me, is the most manipulative part of this pedagogy, and why I object to any claims to it being labeled as some sort of educational invitation or some sort of transformative collective learning process. Because once the educator has rigged the game, there is no fair play, no matter how many niceties you pile on top of it. Now, with this new knowledge, I want to go back to the previous quote. I want to focus on that phrase, create space, because contrary to Professor Boler, no matter how benign she views her methods, a pedagogy of discomfort does not create space in a learning environment, but restricts it. That is, introducing discomfort into the classroom automatically narrows the space, tightens the space, constricts the space, and confines the space by simply broaching subjects that are specifically designed under a collective, non-neutral setting to cause within her students an existential crisis of discomfort, with the overall goal of shattering their worldview. A pedagogy that is purposely designed to provoke emotional discomfort in which the student is surrounded on all sides by their peers, and every action and reaction and every word they may speak or not speak all speak volumes and is closely monitored, then no amount of physical or emotional space will suffice. When human beings are deprived of the ability for calm inner reflection, then the subtleties and nuances of truth slip through our fingers and take a backseat to immediate basic survival. The ability to test our outer environment against our inner selves without duress is crucial. Otherwise, we end up making choices that we may later regret. And yet it's through that door that the precariousness of one's identity resides and should not be purposely tampered with. The enormity of peer pressure or peer influence on adolescent minds, when combined with the desire to fit in and be accepted amongst a classroom of one's peers, cannot be underestimated. Human beings are social beings with a profound sense of inherent social responsibility already hardwired within them. And what this pedagogy does is exploit that desire for acceptance and uses manipulative techniques to gain conformity. Even the most unsophisticated student learns quickly that the only way to make the psychic pain or emotional discomfort stop and be liked and accepted and not be looked upon as a social pariah for the rest of their existence is to acquiesce and admit their guilt. And only then will the discomfort stop, or at least that's what they've been told or been led to believe. But as we already know, that's just the beginning of their own personal struggle sessions towards thought reform. Now, I want to slow down in this next section because I had originally planned and prepared to utilize all this documentation that I have in doing my research for this topic, but I've decided to not use it because that would make this video over an hour and a half long, and I can condense everything I was going to say into a paragraph or less and make this statement, which is this. Make no mistake, what Pedagogy of Discomfort is a form of assimilation. It's the enforcement of an ideology in a classroom setting on your sons and daughters to undermine and shatter their beliefs. This is simply another form of what another author has termed education for extinction. Trust me when I say this, I know that period in American history very well, and I don't know any other way to say this than this. The far left in academia has done it again. They've succeeded because of their adherence to theory in simply recreating the techniques of assimilation. Isolate the child away from the parent or guardian and overwhelm their still growing precious minds with a curriculum that has been designed specifically to create emotional distress and attack their most cherished beliefs from every angle possible in a classroom environment of peers that purposely exploits the child's innate and overwhelming desire for social acceptance. And tell me again how this is not assimilation. How is this not indoctrination? How is this not thought reform? This is not traditional education. This is applied critical theory in the classroom. This is assimilation and indoctrination with a vengeance. Now, I want to focus upon two more sections from this chapter and make a quick comment upon each. In the next section, we come across this sentence. Beyond good and evil lies the possibility, at least in educational transactions, to inhabit an ambiguous sense of self. And this may be deeply discomforting. The educator's own beliefs and assumptions are by no means immune to the process of questioning and shattering. Similarly, it is important that the educator explore what it means to share the student's vulnerability and suffering. Notice the first half of this quote, beyond good and evil. What does this instantly bring to mind, if not Nietzsche's infamous transvaluation of values? This is the very thing I spoke of in part 1 of the series on critical pedagogy. This language is the language of rejection and replacement. It is rejection and supplanting of the underlying values of the West that Professor Boler, following in the footsteps of Nietzsche, is seeking to replace. It's this very idea that lies underneath her calls to occupy a more ambiguous and flexible sense of self. To be specific, moving beyond good and evil means no longer accepting the Judeo-Christian value system of the West. Now, I'm sorry if you disagree with what I just said, but that is precisely what Nietzsche and Boler both mean. And before you leave a comment criticizing my interpretation, please go back and read Nietzsche. Go back to the sources, ad fontes, back to the original. Because if you can grasp this, then you'll grasp this entire system. This is because critical pedagogy is at root a transvaluative system. Now, I'm just going to read that last sentence over again. Similarly, it is important that the educator explore what it means to share the student's vulnerability and suffering. And I'm actually not going to say too much here. Just look at those two words, vulnerability and suffering, and ask this question. When has those two words ever been associated with education, higher education, the university, or academia? Those words and the various connotations surrounding them have nothing to do with education, but everything to do with religion or with religious rites of passage. What kind of teaching methodology is this that purposely strives to induce a state of vulnerability in students and leave them so psychologically exposed, so emotionally raw and tender, that the teacher must now enter into suffering with them? I am going to curse and I apologize, but I need to stress the danger of this pedagogy. What in the hell is this? How is this allowed in a classroom setting? For those who say that critical theory, critical race theory, critical pedagogy, standpoint epistemology, intersectionality, cancel culture, and the entire woke movement is just an exaggeration, or that it doesn't really exist, or that it's not as pervasive as it is, all I can say to you is that you speak without knowledge, because the radical nature of this teaching method, I hope that I have made obvious by now. Now, there's one more quote that I want to go over that I find personally disturbing, or I should say discomforting. On page 197, Professor Boler makes this statement. How are we to decide which good habits are to replace the old? Genuine ethical dilemmas arise. What about the student whose worldview and relation to their community is perhaps so shattered that the pieces don't fall back into comfortable harmony? Now, to Professor Boler's credit, there are at least 3 separate occasions within this chapter where she does raise the issue of who gets to decide what counts as the good, what gives the outside instructor the authority to tell a child or a student that their vision is too selective and their emotions not properly habituated, and ultimately who gets to decide which good habits should replace the old. However, every time these questions are raised, there are no attempts to answer them. Instead, Professor Boler proceeds forward in the full knowledge that she herself does not know the outcome. And in one section, she simply recites the favorite strawman argument of the postmodern critical theorist, that the weaknesses of pluralism, freedom of belief and speech, dialogue, and democracy are insufficient catalyst for change. I'm sorry, but this does not suffice. She is assuming the very thing that needs to be proven. Now, for the sake of argument, I am willing to look past the lack of answers to these questions and deal only with the merit of that last question, which frankly speaking terrifies me. Let me read it again, because I want the moral impact of that statement to sink in. What about the student whose worldview and relation to their community is perhaps so shattered that the pieces don't fall back into comfortable harmony? Ladies and gentlemen, this is not a nursery rhyme. This is not a fictional Humpty Dumpty. These are real human beings with emotions and intelligence, with personhood, with minds of their own. Some with a strong sense of self and others with a fragile, sensitive ego, neither of whom deserve to be manipulated. Speaking as a father, I don't care what golden promises may lie on the other side of this pedagogy. I just know this. I don't want my loved ones to have their beliefs so shattered that they feel like they don't belong to my family, my community, and my people. I am so tired of these far left radical academics who invent some new pet theory of theirs and then foist it upon indigenous people as if this speaks for them and is created to help them, when all it is another form of paternalism and imperialism, albeit this time under the guise of academic imperialism. Now, I want to incorporate one last quote from Professor Boler's 2004 paper, Teaching for Hope, The Ethics of Shattering Worldviews, which is not only a fairly straightforward read, but is also accessible online for everyone, and it's only about 15 pages to read. This is from page 122 of the book that this chapter is part of, but page 4 of the PDF version. As we engage the painful process of recognizing habits is a process of encountering suffering and developing compassion we may not have known we had. The emotional fallout of hegemony for those who do social justice education is that we encounter individuals who are so deeply invested in the dominant cultural values that these values have defined their sense of identity. And to question these values feels emotionally like an annihilation of self. Now, once again, I want to compare Professor Boler's quote with another quote from Robert Lifton's book and just let the language speak for itself. As the assaults continue, and as they are turned inward, he begins to experience one of the most primitive and painful emotions known to man, the fear of total annihilation. This basic fear, considered by some the inherited forerunner of all human anxiety, becomes the final focus for all of their prison pressures. It is fed by every threat and accusation from without, as well as by all of the destructive emotions stimulated within. The fear is compounded by the horrifying realization that the environment seems to be making it come true. Dr. Vincent did not only fear annihilation, he actually felt himself to be annihilated. My eyes are drawn immediately not only to the vivid nature of what is being described, but more importantly, to the similarities of language being used to describe this horrific process, which is the annihilation of self. I have flipped over this phrase hundreds of times in my own head to try and discover even an inkling, as I've done research on this topic, on how an annihilation of self can possibly be a good thing. And I can't find one. In every scenario that I run through my head, that phrase stands out not as liberating, but as terrifying. Yet we have before us today a teaching method that seeks to do just that. Not only is this belief system radical in its conception, but in the final analysis, it is a religion. Disintegration of the self, annihilation of the self, and the remaking of man into this new image, this new creation, this new morally ambiguous self is so overtly religious that even a freshman in an introductory class on religion can spot this. Now, I can anticipate some of the objections that I will encounter with this comparison, such as, you can't be serious. You're actually trying to compare what happened to prisoners of war with what goes on in a classroom. Come on, man. And to that objection, I can only say, no, I am not comparing prisoners of war with students. But what I am comparing is the similar psychological techniques that can be easily extrapolated and plucked from one environment and placed into another and rebranded as pedagogy of discomfort. Nor am I saying that Professor Boler has done this on purpose. However, the frightening question is this: does it make any difference if the end results are the same? Whether this method is by accident or by design has no bearing upon the end result, which is thought control. Now I'm going to bring this video to a close by saying this. I do not view this pedagogy of discomfort as redeemable. You can put guidelines and safeguards around this pedagogy, and you can drench it in flowery terminology of liberation, but there is no salvaging this theory. You see, it's one thing to expose students to different ideas and beliefs that may or may not conform to their own belief system, and give them the space to allow them to either integrate or reject these ideas as they see fit. But it's something completely different when you assume that at the very outset your students' beliefs are already wrong and in need of correction. The older traditional model of education doesn't start off with an ideological axe to grind against the student. This difference is not a difference of degree, but of kind, and therefore makes this pedagogy unredeemable. This is not a theory of education, but of indoctrination. Not only does this pedagogy start off by assuming the student's most cherished beliefs are wrong and in need of correction or re-education, but assumes the very thing that needs to first be proven. It's this petitio, this huge petitio principii fallacy, this ginormous begging the question fallacy that this pedagogy commits, which, if anything, should be the very topic that is open to discussion and or debate within a classroom setting and not already decided beforehand by the educator. And because this starting premise is already assumed, then this means that the learner, the student, is already guilty until proven innocent. This is not only an inversion of the moral universe when it comes to teaching, but a violation of that sacred trust between teacher and student and ultimately teacher and parent. This is not just a different pedagogy, but represents the tip of the spear of an assimilation process into a radical worldview. I leave you with this prescient quote from George Orwell. How does one man assert his power over another, Winston? Winston thought, by making him suffer, he said. Exactly, by making him suffer. Obedience is not enough. Unless he is suffering, how can you be sure that he is obeying your will and not his own? Power is inflicting pain and humiliation. Power is in tearing human minds to pieces and putting them together again in new shapes of your own choosing. Do you begin to see, then, what kind of world we are creating? Progress in our world will be progress towards more pain. Already we are breaking down the habits of thought which have survived from before the revolution. We have cut the links between child and parent and between man and between man and woman. No one dares trust a wife or a child or friend any longer. There will be no loyalty except loyalty towards the party. There will be no love except the love of Big Brother. George Orwell, 1984. Non ducor duco, I am not led, I lead.